The archetype of the wounded healer. This is a concept deeply rooted in psychology and mythology. It was popularized by Carl Jung, although his term was wounded physician. Accordingly, this classical social role of the doctor or the medicine man or the medicine woman is not only precipitated by the practitioner's own illness or trauma, and therefore the catalyst for their pursuit of medical practice, but theorized as prerequisite if their treatments are to be effectual, having transmuted their personal pain into empathy plus wisdom. This qualified them to assume such license to care for the community. And the desired results from those they treated would be the certification for prospective patients. Jung has a quote: the doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. Nowadays, this model has been extended to include any helper, such as a therapist or an instructor, teacher, coach, any social service worker, or even an activist. In my professional experience, this dynamic is often, at least anecdotally, corroborated by my fellow clinicians and MSW classmates, especially those working with populations with mental illness or addiction. In 12-step programs, the sponsor is one who previously struggled, successfully worked the steps as a sponsee to someone, and then with substantial time, alcohol free, might sponsor someone else. And that involvement also supports their ongoing healing. While it's clear from the onset that there's always vulnerabilities on both sides, and their histories are imperfect, and therefore it centers the partnership on a footing of respect and genuineness, in contrast to like a detached expert in the therapist chair or doctor who can just spend a couple minutes with somebody and then write a prescription, but it doesn't feel like there's the same sort of depth of relating. Surveys have been conducted that over the years that suggest a correlation between personal suffering and one's decision to enter the mental health field. So, as one could easily imagine for an AA sponsor, this archetype and Jung simultaneously cautions any healer to continuously monitor their own psychological and emotional states to mitigate the risk of unresolved trauma interfering or counter transferring during their care, during providing care, and depending on what themes present in their patient or participant. Otherwise, this could manifest as projecting their experiences onto the client, or over identifying with the patient, or indulging in the grandiosity of self identification as a healer. This wish to save the world is often a guise for the hidden desire to rule it. Similarly, the compulsion to rescue someone may be the unconscious attempt to fix and control them. Once Jung had a dream that he was small and the patient was a giant because he was starting to believe in his own legend. However, there's a fine line, a fine limited range and appropriateness of self-disclosure when it explicitly or tacitly benefits the participant, not in the service of the provider. And this can contribute to greater authenticity, validation, and therapeutic alliance. My brother was telling me the other day of an acquaintance. I'll try to alter the details to protect patient confidentiality, but person was struggling with autoimmune disease, as is rampant in society today. And the doctor was encouraging in a biologic injection, and the patient was reluctant to take the treatment. The doctor said, if it makes any difference, I suffer from the same condition, and I would be willing to take my medicine with you if you choose, and or if that makes a difference. And it did, and the patient elected to have the intervention and is doing quite well. So this dyad of the healer and the patient is often metaphysical in nature, as the transformation happens in the realm of the psyche, not always perceivable in the manifest world. So anyone listening who thinks, well, I've had a lot of mental instability in my life, or that my pain or my trauma gives me imposter syndrome. Well, this is to encourage you to continue with your self-care and self-kindness. And if that inspires you to give back now or in the future, you're never disqualified. In fact, you may be uniquely positioned in society to be of significant benefit. And it doesn't have to be in the professional sense. This could be in your art, or your story, or perhaps in your work. Just as there's a crucial demarcation between a cartographer, one who draws maps, and a tour guide, one who's actually traversed the mapped terrain and therefore knows firsthand the hazards and can show the way. So this also isn't to suggest that a cartographer can't become a tour guide, or that someone who's only studied psychology couldn't be successful in practice, but rather to clarify that why the wounded should not feel precluded by internalized shame or unworthiness. Now, how far along does one need to be in their healing before assisting others in their healing? Does one need to be fully healed? There may be no definitive answer here, or it could be a spectrum. It depends on the way one aspires to help or the role. In modern times, there are formal steps to certification and regulatory agencies that standardize different professional fields. However, I think that we all embody the dialectic of the healer patient or teacher student. There's always more to learn from someone. And whatever set of experiences we've lived through, there's every possibility of using that to support another. There are teaching assistants and tutors that are still learning the material themselves. When I was in fifth grade, my teacher, Mr. Patelis, who I admired so much, asked me to tutor another student in exchange for a Happy Meal from McDonald's at the end of the year, if it was successful. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty good deal. Again, I appreciate the tradition of sponsoring, sponsee in fellowship groups, as I'm familiar with it from my association in healthcare settings, because the sponsor is very candid about their liability to a substance, and typically also meets with their own sponsor. I heard from someone recently who felt a lot of embarrassment after one time return to using in the wake of a tragedy, but then was uplifted by their sponsor, who said, for all of us who identify as having an addictive relationship or allergy to a substance, then whoever here woke up earliest today has the most time sober. The eminent psychotherapist Irvin Yalom wrote in one of his books, sometimes the very wound we attempt to heal in others is the wound we carry ourselves. That implies that there often remains something unresolved, perhaps because it's too painful, or something else that is even incurable. And what is incurable or inescapable for everyone? The wounded healer archetype in mythology symbolizes an almost arcane archive of self-knowledge. Given the modern evolution, let's say, of the field of medicine, which centralizes chemical medicine, aka pharmaceutical drugs, and the primacy of empiricism, but mostly the gold standard of clinical trials with those drugs. Perhaps a limitation or paradox in contemporary treatments is specialization and hyper-focused, concentrated expertise. A cellular biologist is unlikely to arrive at a comprehensive view of what it means to be human without deep insight into broader social and psychological contexts. And health and healing is always embedded in a wider milieu. And to be successful in healing, one must be able to relate it to those scales, to those systems. Alternatively, a cognitive science is not rendered fully explicable without cellular biology, without grasping the neurological underpinnings of how and why we think. Whereas ancient sages observed everything they could, because there was no modern assignment. That kept their mind open and curious and helped them make connections. The alarming mental health trends today and the numerous humanitarian crises all underscore the need for interdisciplinary approaches to wellness and peace. From antiquity, there was a Greek god, Chiron, who is the quintessential example of the classical motif of the wounded healer, but replete with philosophical prescriptions for stoic and existential health. Chiron was renowned for his knowledge and skill in teaching, healing, and prophecy. Prophecy could literally mean his clairvoyance because he's supernatural, he's a god. But in healing, a doctor should have knowledge of the progression of an illness or condition and does make a prediction or forecast, which now we call a prognosis. Chiron was the son of the Titan Cronus and a sea nymph named Philyra. His birth was bizarre, as Cronus, in a licentious and unscrupulous maneuver to hide from his wife Rhea, transformed himself into a horse. And then his union with the sea nymph resulted in their offspring Chiron's half horse, half human form, a famous centaur. And then Chiron was a student of Apollo, from whom he learned medicine and music and archery and hunting and astrology. Later, Chiron had famous students, notably Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine and healing, who in turn instructed his daughters, the goddess Hygeia, goddess of health and cleanliness, from which we derive the word hygiene, and Panacea, the goddess of universal remedy. The rod of Asclepius, a serpent entwined staff, remains a prominent medical symbol and represents both rejuvenation and the inherent risk of medicine. One of Chiron's other students, Hercules, accidentally shot and wounded his mentor, Chiron, with a poisoned arrow that had been dipped in the blood of the Hydra. The Hydra was a sea monster that Hercules previously had slain. However, as the son of Kronos, Chiron was immortal, so his wound was incurable, dooming him to endless pain. But that didn't stop him from administering kindness and dispensing wisdom to help others heal from their ailments. In one version of this myth, Prometheus, another Titan who was bound to a rock as punishment for bestowing fire to humans, Chiron then, out of compassion for Prometheus and also self-compassion, pleads to Zeus to trade places or trade his immortality for the release of Prometheus. And this act of self-sacrifice allowed him to die, but freed him from his eternal suffering. This is also resemblant of the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, in which desire, often portrayed as a fire, keeps one in the cycle of dukkha, or the wheel of suffering, until self-sacrifice or self-transcendence. Anyways, after his death, in recognition of his righteousness, Chiron was placed among the stars as the constellation Centaurus, or sometimes Sagittarius. And my contemplative interpretation of this for us mortals is that the incurable wound is aging and death. People resist it for sure. We all do for the most part. That's not really the issue. More so, it's the denial of death and the taboo this engenders for younger generations, for our pupils who look up to us. This is an election year, and the presidential race will likely once again come down to the forced choice of two now octogenarians. And that's not an excuse for age discrimination. I think whoever's applying for anything deserves the merit of fair selection process. On the contrary, I just want to say that if it were me, I'd hope that I would not see myself as the answer. Even if I was privileged and wealthy enough and knowledgeable enough, it's not that. It's self-awareness. I would want to have long transitioned to the role of a teacher or advisor or mentor. I hope to be an elder, a consultant, um, in the forest, in the desert. And this is truish for any arc. Um, isn't it reflective of arrogance and attachment? Like in pro sports, we have these prominent mega millionaire star coaches clinging to their position and status as they approach very old age, 80 and beyond. Despite that, so much teaching goes into coaching, and there are so few positions and so little time for anyone to undertake it. Why not transition with an endorsement for the best or worthy pupil who has studied under you? Are these attempts to deny death or cure the incurable? Don't these people's families and loved ones who probably had to sacrifice so much for the sake of these celebrity or political careers, don't they and their children and grandchildren deserve some time back? If I were a coach, I'd say, I'd love to continue to do this. And my mind knows how to do it, but I can't guarantee what my mind will do beyond this month, this year, or my body. This job is round the clock, and I could have the ambition, but my fate may have other plans. So I respect this time for what it is, and I prepare for the next stage. And then from a soul perspective, if birth is the existential wound, so to speak, the soul has this incurable condition of rebirth and incarnating into fear and mortal death over and over until something always adhered to is sacrificed and the suffering is transcended, regardless of the soul aspect or not. When we're born, we must learn how to live because we've been unalive for so long. Then, if we're blessed to witness several decades of life pass by, we must learn how to die because at that point, we've been alive for so long, and being unalive is farther back than we can remember. So, whether by design or by luck, nature and biochemistry assists with this lesson. Ordinarily, healing is rapid in youth, and there's vitality and energy and capacity to enjoy with powerful senses, and all that solicits us more sincerely into the physical form, like the union of a player and their character when someone's engrossed in a video game. Then there's a shift later in life or midlife crisis, and the arc bends towards the earth and the grave. And again, if one is blessed enough, this process is patient and graceful, affording many chances to adjust, to prepare, to reduce, to simplify, to slow down, like an autumn tree, fully reflecting the season it's in, and therefore colorfully complimentary and even celebratory, and tossing those leaves like confetti right before resting in the modesty of its emptiness and the silence of its dormancy. And yet another lens is the dialectics, because Chiron is half man, half horse. This represents the harmonization of our spiritual nature with our corporeal nature, our animal instinct with our moral intelligence, or how to live as an individual, but in balance with the environment. The story of Chiron in a daily pragmatic sense, can inspire self-kindness and patience and grace with yourselves when enduring hardship or pain. And that even if something feels too heavy or our mistakes or your victimization is too much to bear, that you're not alone and that you're not without special value to others. In a modern myth like Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is the gray wizard. When he sacrifices himself to confront the Balrog and save his companions, Gandalf is presumably dead or has a near-death experience in which he has to fully face the demon, which is made of fire and darkness. Those are key elements that comprise the shadow self or the unconscious. Fire is in the form of our aggression or our burning desires, and that nobody knows, perhaps. And darkness is the fear of the unknown or the specter of death. And when he returns triumphant, he's no longer Gandalf the Gray, because gray is the duality. He's Gandalf the White, who's transcended himself. In nature, I want to touch on one other example. The oyster and the pearl. An oyster forms a pearl as a response to an irritant or its own wound. This natural process creates something precious and powerful and attractive for others from a source of discomfort. So this is analogous to the way a wounded healer transforms their injury. A pearl is actually the defense mechanism against the irritant, like a grain of sand that finds its way into the oyster shell. Then it coats the irritant with layers of mineral substance that forms the oyster shell also. And over time, these layers build up around the irritant and eventually forms the pearl. So this irritant, which is essentially a wound to the oyster, triggers its response. And over time, these layers represent like history and the impact of trauma. Pearls, though, are also the tears of the gods or dragons in Western and Chinese mythology, which adds a layer of majesty to these gems. So they also represent purity and enlightenment or liberation because of their pristine or luminescent appearance and circular shape. A few quotes about pearls. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it, from the Gospel of Matthew. Just representing that whatever the wisdom is, it's worth everything to get there. And from the Jewish Talmud, just as a pearl lying in its shell in the bottom of the sea has no value when no one looks at it, but when it's brought up and strung as a necklace, it's precious to its owner. So this means that we have to transmute the suffering and step out there and give back, because that's what completes this process. So this mental model also scales aptly to groups and people. In the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a critique of conventional education that unintentionally reinforces existing structures of inequality, by the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire, who advocated for a method of education that involves open communication and critical thinking, where teacher and student learn together, like the healer and the patient. But there's some quest and synthesis involved with this class struggle. And he has a powerful quote: "Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It's rather the indispensable condition for the quest of human completion." So all the gruesome collective state-sponsored transgressions and institutions of evil, such as slavery, segregation, redlining, apartheids, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, that's never terminated willingly by the perpetrators. Leaders lie or obfuscate the details and dispel conversations about injustice as taboo until it's all past and the victims allies themselves have to transform the conditions until the specific exploitation is no longer profitable or feasible. And when all those public officials are dead, their successors and descendants, enjoying enough dissociation, proudly declassify and denounce those policies while beclouding their own complicity with current depravity, and repeat ad infinitum. In the Book of Disquiet, Pessoa wrote, because men learn only what would be of use to their great grandparents. The right way to live is something we can only teach the dead. So, both individually and in solidarity with community and fellowship, I and we together must strive for our spiritual and common freedom. It won't be given. Like the path of the wounded healer, each of us and together has a pearl to produce from our hurt, from our loss, from our doubt, from our suffering, from our ignorance, from our alienation, or from our rejection or abandonment. The pearl's in our heart. We've got to make peace with ourselves and recover our wholeness, our healthness, our holiness, or claim our birthright to self-realization, and at the scale of societies to restore our relationship with the earth and elevate people to unity and dignity in the eternal quest for human completion, from wound to wisdom.